Hello and welcome. We're going to look at inflation and unemployment. So, that is part of macroeconomics. And there are some of the key problems that affect almost every single country. And when they solve one, they create the other one worst. So, by providing people with more jobs, then they get inflation. By reducing inflation, then they create more unemployment. So it's hard to get the right balance. Let's see if we can find the right balance. So, um, the key definitions here would be unemployment. People willing and able to work, but currently not employed. So, anybody going to the job center asking for benefits will be unemployed. But to be able to claim for benefits, they shouldn't be 16 or less. They shouldn't be students. They shouldn't be studying. They shouldn't have a disability, or they shouldn't be pensioners. Why? Because all those will be under a different category. They're not considered part of the workforce. Uh, the workforce is made up of people willing and able to work, who are either working or looking for work. Now, the unemployed are the ones looking for work. So, how do we measure them? We measure them either through the claimant count or the labor force survey. The claimant count, again, is all those people looking for work who cannot find jobs, so hence they they request unemployment benefits. In other parts of the world, instead, they use the labor force survey, especially if they don't give benefits to the unemployed. Um, so those are the key definitions. Now, the types of unemployment that we have, there's three key types. You have frictional, cyclical, and structural. So cyclical and structural, those are the ones that you need to devote most time into. Frictional are the ones that you should know about, but they are the ones that do not trouble the government that much. The reason being is because frictional, just as the term says, is frictional. They have unemployment, but only during short periods of time. This could be women that get pregnant and hence they leave the workforce for a couple of months, then they go back. Maybe a student who's working hard and then in the summer gets a part-time job, but when he resumes his studies, he leaves work and he goes back to studying. So these are frictional people who are frictionally unemployed, and a lot of them tend to be students or people who just left university or college because they're jumping from job to job trying to figure out what they're going to do in the future. Those are frictionally unemployed. So pretty much anybody who is expected to have a job soon in the future. Because they're expected to have a job soon in the future, there's not really much the government can do. Then we have the other two, cyclical and structural. Now those ones are a problem. Now with the pandemic, we're experiencing both. So let's start with cyclical. Cyclical refers to the economic cycle, and if we look at it's measured by GDP. So the y-axis GDP, the x-axis is time. So you can see that there's a trend. There's a GDP trend, and what's your GDP trend? And then you have the actual GDP. So if we're going above the trend, then we're experiencing a boom. And that's the time when most people are employed, so very low levels of unemployment, but we also get inflation. A lot of spending, a lot of transactions, GDP is high. On the other hand, if it's below the trend, then GDP is contracting. If it's below the trend, then it's negative. So we're currently at a negative GDP, minus 9.6%. So that's 9.6% less transactions that we had the previous quarter. We're in November now of 2020. So how do we calculate GDP? That's consumption, so the amount of money spent by consumers. This usually is kind of the biggest part of GDP, 70%. Investment by the private sector, investing in machinery, plant, raw materials. The government putting money in things like to the NHS, one of the biggest employers, and then exports minus imports. So all these transactions, money spent, that's our GDP. And that relates directly to employment because if people spend, they're spending money on goods and services that someone is making. So the more money they spend, the more employment they create. Now, if on the other hand they're not spending money, then it's likely that we're going to experience unemployment. Just think about all those shops, I don't know, Oxford Street, Piccadilly Circus, all the ones you read on the magazines that are closing down because nobody's shopping. Retail, nobody's shopping on brick and mortar shops. They might be doing it online, but they're not doing it physically. So that means that those shops close down. And with them closing down, you have a lot of redundancies, a lot of people become unemployed. So that is a cyclical, that's the effect of a recession or even a depression. A depression is a long-term recession. So if we have negative GDP for a year or more, then we enter a depression. And it's happened in the past, 1972. So what about the other one? Structural unemployment. So structural unemployment is when the jobs don't match the skills required. So we need scientists to help us with the vaccine, but we don't have scientists that can help us with the vaccine. So hence we have structural unemployment. Or maybe the other way around. Maybe we have excellent engineers, but we don't need excellent engineers, so there's no jobs for them. So again, that is structural unemployment. When the jobs do not match the skills, or when the skills do not match the jobs available. So this mismatch is usually created because an industry collapsed. And industries could collapse for a variety of reasons. Maybe we had outsourced. So in the past, a lot of the IT was done in-house. It was sourced here in the UK, whereas with time now we outsource it elsewhere. So Coca-Cola outsources to Poland, other companies outsource it to India. So they outsource. The same thing with manufacturing. We probably outsource things. In the past, we used to make a lot of clothes here in the UK. Nowadays, we don't. We outsource it elsewhere, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. And the same with customer service. So all those industries collapsed, making many people redundant. They were experts at making clothes. No longer they can use their skills. They probably need to retrain. So again, that's structural unemployment. Think about businesses like Kodak, right, or Jessop's. So they specialize in cameras and film development. In the past, when I was a kid, that was very much in demand, and people, had to be skillful at developing these films. But because the industry collapsed, no longer we need them. And even though they're skillful, there's no jobs that currently require their skill set. So there's a mismatch there. So yeah, structural unemployment, yes, is part of this globalization of being able to outsource products elsewhere, or industries collapsing as technology changes. So what to do with all these both problems, right? So what do we do with cyclical? What do we do with structural? So there's fiscal and monetary solutions. So if you're looking at someone that focuses on fiscal solutions, and then this will be the Keynesian approach. So John Maynard Keynes, around 1930s up to 1950s, even up to 1970s, he very much focused on spending by the government. Fiscal policy is spending on health, infrastructure, defense, and education. So by spending in these areas, you create jobs. More teachers, more policemen, more nurses, doctors. So hence, you create jobs and you reduce unemployment. The downside is, as you reduce unemployment, you generate inflation because people earn money and they start spending more. So that's the drawback, but it's also a solution. Or you can see it from the monetarist side. An advocate of monetarist is Milton Friedman, and he focused on the money supply, so the amount of money being printed and sourced into the economy, as well as interest rates. So, for example, interest rates. By reducing interest rates, people can borrow more money, businesses can invest, they can expand, and hence generate more jobs. Or people can spend more money because they can pay it on credit, and therefore they can keep jobs of people working in those shops where they purchase things from. So that's one of the benefits with lowering interest rates. A Good. So those are the solutions, either again fiscal or monetarist. Um, Next, we need to understand. Well, I guess in our case, I'm just trying to think with the pandemic. Um, so what do you think of solutions for the pandemic? So one would be to focus on the industries that are developing. So a lot of e-commerce. So lately, I see there are a lot of jobs in demand from Deliveroo, Uber Eats. They're recruiting a lot of people as people are buying things online through their phone. Um, Also, supermarkets are recruiting a lot of people. Also, Amazon or these tech companies are recruiting at the moment. So those areas are sort of in growth. Netflix, Amazon Prime, whereas there's areas in decline, and those ones are mainly the ones in retail, the ones in fashion that do not have a good stand on e-commerce. Like Boohoo, for example, or Pretty Little Things, they're doing very well at the moment. But Primark is not doing as well because they don't really have a strong foot when it comes to online e-commerce marketing and selling the product. Instead, they have very big, nice premises, but nobody can see them nowadays because we are not able to go around shopping. So businesses need to adapt, and the government needs to facilitate this to ensure that there's a smooth transition and it doesn't take long for people to retrain or for businesses to adapt to an e-commerce platforms in which people, society can interact with easily through the user experience. Yeah, so that's unemployment, and those are some of the solutions. Think about fiscal. You can use the acronym HIDE, investing in health, the NHS, hospitals, infrastructure, building roads, defense, the army, policemen, or education, investing in more schools, colleges, hence recruiting more teachers. So those are ways to reduce unemployment. Good. Next, we need to look at inflation. So what is inflation? Is an average increase in price levels. So average increase in price levels over a period of time. So that's inflation. Now we also have deflation, which is the opposite, when it's an average decrease in price levels. Currently, we can see deflation in quite a few countries, like Greece, for example. I think it's minus 1.6. So it's minus 1.6, a reduction in prices on what they were last year. So that's inflation and deflation. However, if inflation reduces but is still positive, then it's called disinflation. We still have an increase in price levels, but it's not as high as it was before. So that's disinflation. So those three keywords to know. Good. When we look at inflation, what are the pros and cons? The downside of it, I tend to use the acronym TUMI. I'm Peruvian. TUMI is like a tool they used to use. Doesn't matter. So T is for with high inflation, we have high level of taxes, and people don't like taxes. Consumers don't like taxes, so that's not very good, or at least not for consumers. U is uncertainty. High levels of inflation draw uncertainty. People don't know what's going to happen. If you have a business, how are you going to plan ahead? You don't know how much your materials are going to cost the next month. M is for we have exports. Yes. Well, no. M is for. Gosh, no. Well, I is certainly for inequality. Inequality because if I'm earning £20,000 and inflation is increasing at 10% every month, then my wage is staying the same, but I buy less things with my wage. In comparison, someone that earns 100,000, if inflation is still going at 10%, he still has more money to spend over time. So inflation affects the poor more than the rich. So it creates that income inequality. It affects exports and imports. Yep. So when we're looking at exports, high inflation means we export less because the pound increases in value. As prices go up, other businesses or other countries are not going to buy our products. They're going to buy from elsewhere. So imports theoretically go down. So that is bad for consumers. and for businesses and for the economy. So that's the downside of inflation. The upside of inflation is if you borrow money and you gotta pay it back. Inflation means that you will have to pay less. I'll explain why. So if I have a house and I borrow, I don't know, £100, um, so inflation would have driven up the value of my house from, I don't know, from £100 that I used to purchase it to, let's say, £1,000. Inflation has driven up the prices. So by the end, if I sell my house, it'll be a lot easier to pay that debt, because inflation has appreciated the value of my goods. So that could be one of the benefits if you borrow money at a fixed rate and inflation has taken place. Other than that, is usually not very good for the economy. It helps with the fluidity because people cannot save. It's uncertain, so you want to spend quickly. This happened in Russia around 2008. There was a high level of inflation, so people were not saving money because they were losing money. The value was losing itself very quick as prices were going up. So they were just spending it, buying cars and houses because that retained value in comparison to the actual currency. So again, pros and cons. The pros, more purchases. The cons are, well, uncertainty, and people don't feel very secure, especially with their savings. So when we're looking at inflation, there is something called the Oken's law, and it's actually not the Oken's law. When we're looking at inflation, there are two main causes to inflation. One is the demand pull inflation, that is prices going up because people are demanding goods and services, and there is the cost push inflation, and that is prices going up not because there's demand, but because the cost of production has gone up. And this happened in 1972. So this is a good example. So in 1972, so those are price levels. This is our aggregate quantity. We have our aggregate demand, our aggregate supply. So this is 1972. So in 1972, we used to depend on oil from the Middle East and the US as well, and they formed an oligopoly with Saudi Arabia, with Russia, with Venezuela, and they increased the price of crude oil. So that meant that for the UK to pay for oil to run their cars, heating, electricity, energy, the cost increased. So you see, from AS1 suddenly went to AS2. The cost increased, and this drove costs up. So you and I would have to pay more money for our fuel, for our energy costs. So that drove inflation up. Prices started going up. See the price level there from PL1 to PL2. And this is because externally, the cost of crude oil was high. Internally, what they tried to do was, the government tried putting less money into the economy. So they reduced their spending on health, infrastructure, defense, thinking that by taking money away, this will bring price levels down. But it didn't. It was the opposite. It was even worse, because they still had inflation, but now they had even more unemployment. So for the first time, it wasn't like one was going up and one was going down. They were both going up, which is terrible, inflation and unemployment. And this brought recession and depression in the US. And the same exact thing happened in the UK. And this was due to this exogenous, external shock from high oil prices in the UK. So we have our quantity, our aggregates there. Yeah, so anything that increases the aggregate costs will cause cost push inflation, and that is pretty bad, especially because this is usually caused due to external circumstances. So we might be experiencing some of that as we see supply chains breaking down due to COVID. This might increase certain costs that will then be passed on to us, to the consumers, causing inflation, potentially. Then the other one is demand pull. So demand pull inflation is when it usually happens when the government has printed too much money and there's too much money flowing in the economy, and eventually everybody starts purchasing goods and services. So hence there's a shift in demand. It could be also because there's an increasing population, because migration has the rules have either decreased or they have deregulated, and they allow more people into the country, and so hence there's a higher demand for goods and services, and this will shift out the aggregate demand curve, causing inflation. And those are the main two reasons that we see for an increase in inflation. Good. Other than that, make sure you answer the questions below. Make sure you keep studying. Your degree or your A level depends only on you. You are the main driver of your grade. So keep it up.